presentation as well. So if you do not want to be recorded, you can change your name to guest and turn your video off, and that will just keep you anonymous. Lastly, all of the questions will be answered at the end by Rob, so just hold tight to those. Cool, great. So, well, yeah.
Can you just make an announcement to make sure everybody on Zoom sees the chat box?
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to cover that lower, if that's okay. Yep. Great. Welcome to the Watershed Education Network's third speaker series. This presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as part of a media assistance grant donated to the Watershed Education Network by MCAT. This will be aired on MCAT channel 189 and will be downloaded to video on demand at a later date. Cool. I'd like to start off with acknowledging that the Watershed Education Network recognizes that we are on the sacred grounds of the Bitterroot Salish, Upper Pend Oreille, and Kootenai Native American people. Today and every day we honor the path they have always shown us in caring for the environment for generations to come. Cool. Hello and welcome again. This is part of our winter speaker series. Thank you everybody for coming tonight, taking the time out of your evening. Rob, thank you for coming and talk to us. I'm Brooke Bauer. I'm WEN's communication coordinator. Asa over there, hi Asa, is our stream team coordinator. She will be monitoring this chat box for our Zoom friends. For those of you on Zoom, just a little bit of housekeeping. Keep an eye on the chat box for related articles and links. You can find the chat box under More on the upper part of your screen and then select Chat and then you're there. You can put any questions for Rob during that time or during the presentation in that area. And we'll have Asa relay them at the end of the presentation. You can also direct message Asa in the chat box at any moment if you have any technical issues, and she'll help you troubleshoot that in any way she can. And then lastly, we ask you to stay muted throughout the presentation so all of the attention can be on Rob and his presentation. I'd also like to introduce Steffi Novak over there. Steffi is our stream team assistant. She's going to be working behind the scenes, running all of our tech stuff for the in-person event and Zoom. Yeah, so Asa and Steffi, in case you don't know, they run the stream team, our citizen science stream team. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask them at the end. And if any come up later, we have our emails right here, and you can feel free to reach out to them at a later date. I'd also like to introduce two wonderful people who are not here with us today. Deb, our executive director, and Sarah, our fabulous grant writer. Cool. So just a little introduction to WEN. Most of you are familiar faces, but I'm going to just for the new faces, first of all, welcome. I'm going to take a moment to familiarize everyone with WEN and how you can get involved and just kind of the programs that we run. So WEN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, originally started in our executive director's basement in 1996. From that point on, WEN has led community members and students through our watersheds. And the Winter Speaker Series is just an extension of that and is a way for us to keep the conversations flowing about the importance of water throughout the winter and now the spring. It's warmer now. Yeah, so you must be thinking, wow, WEN is the coolest? What are some of the programs we have? Let me tell you. So we have our citizen science stream team, as I mentioned before, that Asa and Steffi run. And that happens through the summer into the fall. And this program is collecting important stream data, with our community members and students, and we share this data with entities such as the University of Montana, TU, and the Forest Service and the public. We also have our youth and school programs, and this works on getting kids and students into the creek, learning about their watershed as well. Backcountry Stream Corps is a program for high school aged people who it gets them out surveying fish habitat through conducting large woody debris surveys. And this work is stipend. It's a really cool opportunity for high school aged students. If you know anyone who is high school aged or interested in being outside and getting paid for it and collecting data, direct them towards us. You can find the application on the website, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit. We also have our Family Citizen Science, which is a pilot program that gets families in and learning about their creeks as well. And next we have RISE Big Sky Challenge, which RISE stands for Resiliency, Innovation, and Sustainability for the Environment. And this is a really cool program in partnership with Brightways Learning. And it gives students the opportunity to develop ideas and solutions to improve resiliency to environmental disasters in their communities. And the winning project gets money to implement their project too, which is really neat. And then we have the Winter Speaker Series here right now where we are. It's the first year that we've run it. We hope everybody's enjoying it. Our last one is happening at the end of April, on April 25th on When Data. And then lastly, we have our Welcome to Your Watershed outreach strategy, which is launched to inform, engage, and educate community members about their watersheds and just solutions and strategies and projects that are going on within it. So coming up in April, we have quite a few events kind of jumping into action again. First, starting off with the Stream Team training on April 10th. And this will be a really great opportunity to learn about when and how we collect data and how you can get involved. On the 13th, we have groundwater monitoring, which will be in Greeno Park, and it will give volunteers the opportunity to open different wells and measure the depths of the water table at various locations, which is neat. And then we're jumping back into community pint nights, starting with Imagination Brewing. This is going to be really fun. We're planning on bringing a little piece of the creek into the tap room. So you're just going to have to come and figure out what that is, because it's going to be really fun. And then on April 18th, we have our youth program volunteer orientation. And this is an introduction on how to work with kids in our WEN youth programs. And then the next speaker series is on the 25th at Good Works Ventures, and that's going to be on when 2020 or 2019 and 2020 data. And then lastly, we have on May 4th and 5th, we're participating again in Missoula Gives, and this is going to be a really fabulous community fundraising opportunity to raise money for nonprofits like WEN. So just keep your eyes open for that. I'm going to show you guys real quick where you can sign up for all these fun things. So you can see all of the links right here. This is our website, montanawatershed.org, and you can sign up for any of the programs that I just talked about on this site by clicking the button. For Stream Team, groundwater, youth programs. You can also learn about our story, learn more about our team and the board of directors and so on. We also have additional information about programs, WEN programs, the Stream Team. Load. Come on. Well, I promise it's there. If you just click there, it will take you to the Stream Team page and a little bit more about what we do in the creek with our community members, and then so on with all the other programs. If Backcountry Stream Corps will load, there's a little button on the top on the left that will say 2022 job applications, and that's where we're directing our applicants for Backcountry Stream Corps. You can also sign up for our speaker series right here, our next one. And then we also have like a lot of fun resources for about teaching you about our watershed, about macroinvertebrates. It's almost next month is our next bug of the month, and it's really fun to just learn about that. We also had a really fun project this winter where we took some of our volunteers from Stream Team and interviewed them and got some really cool feedback on the greater impacts of citizen science on our community. And you can see some of the cool feedback and quotes right there, along with other resources. And there's a donate button. Oh, there we go, that loaded. So that's just what that page kind of looks like, which is fun. And for all of these events, it's I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter, because that's a good way to get active updates on our events and other fun when related stories or news. It's just a great way to stay in the nose of what's going on with when. And I think that is all I've got to say. I'm going to introduce Rob now, our wonderful speaker. You can come up whenever you're ready. Everybody, welcome Rob. Woo! Let's just pull up your PowerPoint real quick. There you go.
Do I need that microphone?
Yes. There you go.
Okay, we got this.
Mm-hmm.
And the microphone for Zoom, where are we talking? Is it off of this computer?
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can they see me in there? Hello?
Cool. Take it away.
I usually pace around, but I don't want to make him kind of follow me back. All right, guys. Thanks for having me. My name is Rob Roberts. I work for Trout Unlimited here in Missoula. I'm a project manager with TU, which basically means I do anything and everything to put a project on the ground that'll improve fisheries. I work on mine reclamation projects. We put fish screens on irrigation ditches to keep fish out of irrigation canals. We do stream channel reconstruction, all sorts of other projects. And some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you tonight is some of the more unique work I've been involved in the past. And which is basically right here in our backyard in Rattlesnake Creek, which flows, into the Clark Fork River, just probably a couple hundred feet from here, just on down the road. So, I'm going to talk about not only the wilderness dams in the Rattlesnake National Recreation Area and Wilderness, but also a little bit about the Rattlesnake Dam Removal Project, which happened last year, since that kind of sets the stage for the watershed context of what's going on with those dams, why we're working up there, what that means for the creek, so on and so forth. This whole project is basically a big collaboration, largely with the city of Missoula, who now owns and operates the dams and all the infrastructure related with it, but also Montana Fish and Wildlife Works, obviously, when other watershed partners who are working in the drainage, and around the area. So this is an old sketch from the 1920s showing Rattlesnake Creek. And what I think is really interesting about this is this kind of shows how people conceptualize Rattlesnake Creek, the lakes, and the use of those lakes. So really what this is, a bunch of little circles at the top that represent the 10 or so main rattlesnake lakes. There are actually about 45 potholes and lakes in the Rattlesnake area, but only about 10 to 15 actually have names. You can see Rattlesnake Creek coming down, which is basically a conveyance mechanism for water. And then that little thing in the middle is the Rattlesnake Dam, which then diverted all of the water to downtown. Many of you know this, but Rattlesnake Creek was the main water source for the city of Missoula up until 1983, and it goes back as far as even before 1904 when the main dam was built. Actually, Warden and Higgins dug the first ditch on Rattlesnake Creek in like 1875 or something like that to send water to what is now downtown for mills, for stockyards, for everything else that was going on. So Rattlesnake has kind of a crucial, important role in the history and development of Missoula. And this sort of shows like how they contextualized the water system for Missoula and how they were going to get it there. So the rest of the history of the site, you can see a picture of the old dam structure before it was faced with concrete up in the upper right. And obviously these guys sitting on some of the stone walls. Like I said, the dam was built in the early 1900s to provide water to the city of Missoula. It never had any power generation. It wasn't built for flood control. It was purely for moving surface water to downtown. In about 1924, it was faced with concrete. They added the reservoir on it, and then they started around that time and before working on the Wilderness Dams. Essentially what was happening was in the summer, the city was running out of water as Rattlesnake Creek got lower. They had to go up, start impounding lakes in the Rattlesnake Wilderness, which wasn't a wilderness then, which they could then release in July, August, September when water was low, bring it down through the creek, divert it to downtown. So they ended up building 10 dams on 8 lakes. So there's 8 lakes that are impounded. 2 of the lakes actually have 2 dams on them that were built at different times. And like I said, this worked until 1983. If you guys grew up here, you were drinking tap water that came from Rattlesnake Creek. In fact, some people have told me they used to have fish shoot out their tap if they didn't have a little screen, on the bottom of their tap. There was a boil order in 1983, and that's when the Mountain Water Company at the time started basically digging groundwater wells in the aquifer, which is, underlaying downtown. We have a really amazing, plentiful aquifer that's not that deep. It starts as shallow as I think 25, 30 feet and goes deeper. And right now it's actually basically maintaining its level based upon usage and inputs, which is a really awesome thing, given what's going on in the world. In 2017, the city of Missoula essentially acquired the Mountain Water Company, all of its assets and infrastructure. That included, the stuff they wanted, which was the pipes, the aquifer wells, the transmission lines, and they sort of got handed this stuff on Rattlesnake Creek, which was worth no money and was all deteriorating and falling apart. And we'll talk about some of that. The only thing they really got on Rattlesnake Creek that was worth anything was the paper water rights, which are involved in the dams, in the wilderness, and the main creek itself. We'll talk some about that. So like I said, I'm going to start talking about a little bit the project up at the dam, because it's sort of, since we're going to talk about dam decommissioning and other activities in the wilderness, sort of sets the stage for that. So this is the lower Rattlesnake Dam in about 2019. You can see its condition on the top right there. I mean, it's very obvious. It's cracking. It's falling apart. There used to be ladders and walkways on the top. They took those off. I was told by Mountain Water Company employees who now work for the city that at high flows, it actually shook so bad that people were afraid to walk out on top of it. So they started removing infrastructure from the top. These 2 little windows in the bottom used to be shut in about the it was like 2014. They permanently welded them open. So there were sort of these 2 windows in the bottom. At high flow, it still impounds, pours over the top, or it did. And at low flow, it would shoot out these 2 little windows right here. You can see the reservoir, bottom left picture right here at full pull. And then you can see the reservoir when we drained it to do some of our data collection work. You can see what it looked like at low pull right there. So the goals for this project, were fairly numerous and went beyond, watershed health and fisheries. One of the city's most important goals and one of their main aims for this project was basically reduce the cost of operating and maintaining this site, right? Like I said, it didn't hold any water. It didn't supply any water. It was theoretically an emergency supply to Missoula, but there was a lot that would have had to happen to actually make that work in that way. It was a liability problem. It was falling apart. They knew they had to do something about it. They obviously wanted to reduce the public safety hazards at the site. And then we sort of had the resource goals, which were to rehabilitate the stream and the floodplain, promote fish passage. The dam had, quite obviously prevented fish from swimming from the Clark Fork River to upstream in Rattlesnake Creek for over 100 years, from 1904 all the way until 2004, which was when there was a fish ladder put on the dam by FWP and TU that partially allowed fish to maneuver around the dam site. And then, the big thing and the cool thing that's happening now is how to incorporate public recreation and usage, not only, into the overall site and the acreage, but how to do that during a design process for a dam removal, thinking about future public access areas, where the public's going to want to go, how the space is going to be used. We started envisioning that, 3-4 years ago when we started the actual engineering part of the process at the same time. Whoops. I think did I just skip two? Oh, yeah. So, some of the kind of interesting challenges and obstacles here, some of which will be relevant to the wilderness dams. Like I said, a lot of people thought that it was people always think dams generate power. That's not true at this site and many dams. And they also thought it prevented floods from coming down Rattlesnake Creek and impacting homes. That first one is interesting because if you do the math, that reservoir held enough water at high flow that it would prevent a flood for about 15 minutes at spring flow. So as soon as the creek came up, it would hold water for about 15 minutes and then start gushing over the top. So there really was no flood control ability from that reservoir or dam. Below the dam, we have lots of residential and commercial areas. We're kind of in part of it right now. We have, I think I counted 14 bridges on Rattlesnake Creek. We have a railroad bridge, highways, footbridges, you name it. There's lots going on below it. You have to think about that when you're removing a dam on a creek. It was highly publicly visible right along the trail. And it was a pretty big project to accomplish in actually kind of a confined area, with a cliff, you got trails, you got roads and houses. There wasn't a lot of space actually to move around. And we were our permitting was pretty laborious because of the area we were in, really near downtown. So we had numerous permits we had to deal with to get the project off and running. And then seeing as it was 100 years old, we had to go through a lot of historical review and compliance. And actually, I think we wrote like a 300-page historical mitigation document to get the project done, which I'll never do again. I'll pay someone to do it next time. So design approach, I like this one because this impacts where you go with the project, as it evolves. And we decided through a public process, many of you might have been involved, to remove all the infrastructure, man-made infrastructure from the site in the floodplain. That was great because that basically meant we were trying to create a clean, natural slate. We were trying to balance our earthwork, which meant anywhere we were removing material, we were trying to find a place on site to put material and basically not import or export gravel, rocks, you name it. Because not only is that stuff expensive if it comes from far away, but we also had that access road up Rattlesnake Creek is pretty limited, right? It goes up to the trailhead. It's 2 lanes. It's kind of tight and narrow. That could have turned into a real problem if we had to take a lot of equipment, haul trucks up and down all the time. So we decided to try and minimize that to the greatest extent possible. We wanted to reconstruct the channel, the floodplain, and restore all our stream function and processes. And then constant stream gradient, that's a little technical, but that basically means we want the creek to fall at the same rate from the top of the project site all the way to the bottom. And that basically means that like incoming gravel and sediment, we're not going to have huge accumulations that are piling up, nor are we going to be evacuating tons of sediment downstream that could cause problems, where we have homes, where we have other infrastructure. This is just a design plan view of the project. I'm not going to go into this a ton, but basically it just shows you cut and fill. So anything in dark red or orange means that's being excavated. Anything in blue means that it's being filled. So all that really shows you is that huge red blob where the dam and the embankment was being taken out. and then the old reservoir, which is all the blue thing, basically being filled in. And in my mind, we were doing the reverse of what happened in the early 1900s, right? They probably took the material where the reservoir was, piled it up here. We were sort of putting it back in place. This gets into a little bit more of like the actual structures for the stream channel restoration reconstruction. You can see the little log jam symbols on the outside bends, little rocks showing where riffles are, and then that whole area with the green and blue basically showing a floodplain with wetland cells and little ephemeral, stream channels coursing through the site. And to me, that's one of the coolest parts about the project is if you get a chance to walk up there here in the next couple months, you'll see water spreading out across the project site. You'll see waterfowl using the site. If you can get in there, you'll see amphibians and, and small fish coming into these little side channels and ponds. It's going to be a really neat place in a few years. Yeah. Construction wise, just a few numbers, a few pictures here. I think that upper right picture is pretty cool. That's all rebar that came from the site. We actually removed 80,000 pounds of rebar from the dam that was removed from the concrete. Per our permitting, we couldn't, all the concrete from the site was buried on site in repositories, but we couldn't bury any rebar that was sticking out by itself. So any pieces of rebar that were sort of by itself sticking out had to be flush cut. So there were literally guys out there in the summer with torches cutting out that rebar and pulling it out. And we took it all to Pacific Steel and the receipts were 80,000 pounds, which is a hell of a lot of steel. You can see we had to build a temporary stream channel with a temporary bridge over the stream channel for all our haul trucks to get back and forth to move material. That was a huge part of the project. And we ended up moving about 20,000 cubic yards of dirt and rock. That's about 2,000 standard dump truck loads for, just for reference there. We did import, the only thing we really imported to the site besides like, fencing and other things like that were 700 plus large trees and limbs and logs. All of that actually came from Lolo Creek at the Lee Creek campground of Lolo Creek, if you guys have ever been there. The Forest Service did a campground thinning project and we went up and basically hauled trees out of there for 4 days and brought them down to the site to incorporate into log jams, into the floodplain, into other structures. That brown trout, I think it was a brown trout, that was taken from just below the dam. As we were pumping out the hole, these fish started showing up, and that guy who's actually a guide in town found that big brown trout sitting there. I'll just rattle off a few numbers of, what we accomplished out there, and then we can move on to the wilderness dams. But, by removing the dam, we essentially reconnected about 12 miles of rattlesnake for fish passage from the river. We got 2,000 feet of new side channels. The actual stream, Rattlesnake Creek, was about 1,000 feet of reconstruction, 4 acres of wetland. And one interesting note on the plant is, we actually installed, with the help of Clark Fork Coalition, the city, some other groups, 16,000 container plants that the city grew at their own greenhouse from seed that we collected along Rattlesnake Creek. So kudos to the city Parks and Rec Department, for just an amazing job having a greenhouse that we could partially dedicate to growing out all those plants on site. The willows came from the golf course up here on the Clark Fork, just in East Missoula, willow cuttings. And tons of volunteer hours. And this is an interesting one here. If you actually go back and look at all the different contracts and suppliers, it's actually 30 regional, state and local businesses that were hired to do different parts of the project out there. And I think that's a number that doesn't usually come across when a lot of people talk about projects like this. It's about $1.5 million all told from the, design process through construction. And then, just some photos. it'll be exciting. This creek is coming up. You guys probably know that right now. You know, we're getting some snow melt, so it'll be exciting to see it this year. But top left was high water at the very top of the site before it came out. Same spot over on the right the next year. And then obviously here looking upstream at the fish ladder at the old dam, and then the same site on the lower right. You guys can read this. I won't get into this because most of our monitoring is really not complete because we're just 1 year out from the project. So, you know, there's a lot of data collection left to be done. But here's some of the things that WEN and other groups, FWPTU, are all looking at to kind of assess the impact of the project. Lessons learned. This is a, you know, I always like to look back on these projects, see what you did wrong, what you did right. I think that, you know, I give a lot of credit to the city of Missoula on this project and their overall, you know, ability to evolve and adapt and be maneuverable when it comes to these projects. And we'll talk about that with the Wilderness Dams. But, you know, they have a great team and a great crew of people, and they did a wonderful job, and they're very forward thinking. And, you know, I'm looking forward to working with them, you know, in the next projects. And our partners and funders, lots of them. So, the Wilderness Dams. So like I said, that dam was built to basically impound water that was coming down from the creek, coming down from the Wilderness Dams, or the Wilderness Lakes, which have dams on them. You know, that lower dam was the transmission dam. These are the storage dams. This is where the water comes from, where it's held. The city acquired the rights to all these dams at the same time that they bought Mountain Water Company, got the lower dam, got all of the infrastructure downtown. Like I said, there's 10 dams on 8 lakes. Interestingly, 5 of those dams were built in the early 20s before the Forest Service was a thing, right? So they predate the Forest Service. 5 of those dams were built after the Forest Service became a thing. So that changes the way they're managed. And the technical terminology is there's 5 easement dams, 5 special use permit. Special use permit means they were made after the Forest Service. You have to get a permit from the forest to use them. The total storage volume is approximately 22 CFS if you add it all up. It's a decent amount of water. Rattlesnake Creek's base flow drops as low as 10 CFS in the summer. So it's theoretically twice as much as the base flow of Rattlesnake Creek. And then, you know, obviously the Rattlesnake Wilderness was formally designated in 1980. The water company before that, it was specifically written into the Wilderness Act in 1980 that the managers of the water company had the right to use mechanized equipment to operate and maintain the dams. And fisheries, there's a mixed fishery up there. They've stuck all kinds of fish in different dams. There's Yellowstone cutthroat up there. There's rainbows up there. There's brook trout in Upper Rattlesnake Creek. So there's all kinds of different stuff that shouldn't be up there, but is. And, you know, we'll talk about what the city has analyzed and where we're going with it here. There's actually some pretty good information on these dams. This is a engineer's sketch of Sanders Lake on the right here. And it's super cool. And I pulled out some of the kind of the neat figures that are on here because you obviously can't read it. But it literally says the number 1 dam took 4 months with 15 men and 6 mule teams. The number 3 dam was 3 months with 15 men and 6 teams. It shows us how many cubic yards of earth they move, how many cubic feet of rock is in the crib dam. Basically, they build like a wooden structure and then they fill it with big boulders and then they pack dirt around it. So all of these dams up here have an interior made of rock and wood. It's called a wood crib with rock inside of it. Shoreline cleared, 6.7 acres of timber, you know, so they logged it off. They used some of it to build the dam. They probably shipped some of it out of it, used the other for firewood. This is how much people made while working up there in the early 1920s. $3 a day to work up there and work on these dams. And every one of these lakes has one of these things that is at Missoula Water right now, pretty much, that shows us what happened. It's pretty amazing to find this kind of, you know, historical information. So here's some pictures, just random pictures of different spots. I don't even know exactly what all of them are. Sanders I talked about. Sanders is on the bottom right. It's an amazing place. You can see it drops off this cliff wall right here. And Sanders is actually 220 feet deep. It's by far the deepest lake up there. Most of them are 30, 40, 50 deep. Sanders is like 220. And I have no idea how it formed, but it's an amazing spot if you ever get a chance to get up there. And it is pretty difficult to find your way up there. And I think I have another picture of the outflow of Sanders right there. So goals for this project are pretty similar to what we talked about for the lower dam removal. Again, the city's paying, the taxpayers, the water ratepayers are paying on an annual basis to maintain these dams, right? You got to deal with weeds, you got to deal with blockages in the dams, you got to go up and inspect. It's not a ton of money, but it costs money to maintain them. Right now, they're not providing any benefit, right? There's no storage water, no one uses the water. The city has to make some long-term decisions about how they're going to manage these dams, what they're going to do with them. Not only because the Forest Service is asking them to, because the dams are deteriorating, but because ultimately they're sort of holding the bag for paying, to maintain these things in their current condition. Safety hazards are, there's not a huge risk here, but it's a possibility that some of these could deteriorate and actually fail, in the future. They are 100+ years old in some cases. And basically, the city's looking to figure out how we can, or, how the public, how the city, how partners can figure out how to maximize public and environmental benefit, considering all the constraints that are going on up here. And we'll talk about some of those. And obviously trying to balance wilderness character with the need to figure out how to operationalize or decommission these dams, right? Missoula Water is a water utility. They have to make sure to use their assets correctly for the ratepayers, for the city, but balancing the fact that these are in a designated wilderness area. Even though they have the right to use equipment to operate and maintain them, there's still some long-term decisions to be made. The water rights are probably the biggest interesting feature of this, in the sense that there's 20+ CFS of water, several thousand acre feet, that's not being used at all. And it's a water right on paper that the city holds. I mean, that's worth money on paper in theory, but only if you can use it. So the city's trying to figure out, what does that really mean in practical context? Because there is a term called abandonment in Montana water rights law that basically means if you're not using it, you lose it. You lose your ability to keep that paper water right. So that's one thing they have to consider moving forward. So a little bit more, digging into water rights a little bit here. This is basically a chart that shows the different claimed water rights for each lake. And the claim volume. It's a little bit technical, but basically you can see that 1, 2, 4th column sort of shows how many CFS, the volume of water that each lake holds. And you can see that it's between 1 and 7 CFS. We talked about Sanders. Sanders has 7 CFS, and then Big Lake has 5 CFS. So those are sort of like the big ones in the context of the water rights here. So where we're at right now, the city went through a feasibility study process, sort of high level, big picture. What could happen with these dams? Well, we could rehabilitate them. We could rebuild the dams. We could, make them operational. And here's what it would cost: a lot of money. We could remove all of them and get rid of them and just be done with this. Or maybe, there's the consultants who did the report throughout a number of different variables. We have all the background information on water rights. We have the background information on acreages, history, when they were built, all that kind of stuff. Sort of the running plan right now is to develop a pilot project to decommission one of these dams, which is McKinley Lake, and I'll talk about that. McKinley Lake's a small dam. It's got a small water right. It's sort of out in the middle of nowhere. It's already been lowered because it is not storing water because there's a head cut below the dam that's been causing problems. There's some erosion problems. So it's one of these sites that kind of makes sense, like, let's just decommission this thing, get rid of it. And the city can relinquish their special use permit or their easement and the necessity to actually pay to monitor and maintain the dam. Essentially, restore it back, renaturalize it, hand it back to the Forest Service, be done with it forever, and get rid of that cost. So right now, that's what we're working on. I'll talk more about it, is a planning and design process to decommission McKinley Lake Dam. Talk about that next. But hopefully in the summer, fall of, not this summer, but 2023, we would do that. At the same time, working through an engineering process analysis to look at whether there's an opportunity to effectively rehabilitate, i.e. rebuild any of the dams so that we can effectively capture the storage water and use the storage water in the future. And now that it's not municipal water, the use would be for the benefit of fisheries, wildlife, drought resiliency, climate change, you name it, recreation. So can we rebuild the dams? What would it cost? Is it feasible? And what would be the benefits to that? You know, how much can we improve the flow in Rattlesnake Creek? What impact can we have on stream temperature, which is a huge issue for fisheries? So I'll talk some more about it, but we've basically been releasing water from Big Lake over the past couple summers and monitoring the effect on Rattlesnake Creek in terms of stream flow and stream temperature to see what benefit we could have to the creek. And at the same time, the city is still inspecting and monitoring dam conditions on all of the other dams. They have to do that per, their agreements with the Forest Service on an annual basis. So McKinley Lake, here's McKinley Lake in the bottom right. You can see right now, you can see a lot of the shoreline because like I said, it's lower than it has been historically, probably about 10 to 15 feet based on the outlet. Like I said, it has a small water right. It's an easement dam, which means it predates the Forest Service. There is some erosion on the outlet of the dam. There's seepage at the toe of the dam coming through that rock crib core. And the maximum depth at full pool is only 28 feet for McKinley Lake. So one of the issues, that is a possible benefit is recreational fishing and boating in the wilderness, right? This lake is already so shallow, especially with this drawdown, that the fish population is pretty much dwindled to the point where it's almost non-existent. We're actually not even sure if there's any fish left in this lake. There was rainbow trout in this lake. It's actually a benefit from a fishery standpoint to get rid of the rainbow trout because it's a non-native species at the top end of a watershed with native cutthroat. So even if these rainbow trout blank out because of this, it's actually probably a good thing. It would likely return to a fishless high mountain lake where amphibians and other, wildlife would take over. This is that in the top right is more of kind of a classic engineering sketch of a preliminary design. I sort of did this on the bottom left to make it much more palatable and easy to read. So on this aerial photo, you can see real simple scribbles, a cut in blue and a fill in red. So the idea is here, you would basically not take out the entire dam. The entire dam actually goes about 150 feet across. It's way too long to probably remove with, the kind of equipment or manpower we would have up there, nor is it necessary to take out the entire dam to effectively remove, the safety and the resource problem. But notch the dam about 40 to 70 feet across, all the way from top to bottom to the original lake level, take all that material and then basically put it in that area with the red squiggle on the left, a little bit along the shoreline, blend it in to the point where it renaturalizes over the time. It more or less looks like a natural high mountain lake, but it does probably preserve some of the historical character of the rock walls and some of the dam that was there because, one of the things we do have to consider and likely we'll have to consider working with the Forest Service is that preservation of historical character, just like we did on the lower Rattlesnake Dam site. So I think, again, that's the real preliminary sketch in the top right. That will obviously go through a more refined design process. This is sort of the 2-bit image that shows what would happen out there. But I think it will actually look something a lot like that. And I think we talk about methods here. So methods are sort of the crux of this project, right? With the lower Rattlesnake Dam removal, one of the reasons I talked about that you saw big equipment, excavators, all this stuff going on. It's not a possibility up here to do that. I mean, we do have the opportunity to fly some equipment in potentially, but it's certainly not going to be tons of yellow machines like it was at the lower dam. You know, a helicopter that could carry one of those machines costs $60,000 an hour, you know, to transport a machine like that. So that's obviously outside of our range. If we use equipment, it's going to have to be smaller equipment. It's going to be less equipment. And we're also going to have to look at the possibility of using more traditional methods. I don't think it's going to be men with mule teams, you know, like it was originally built in the past, but there are some ways to do it. The Forest Service has a process that you work through when you're working in a wilderness area to sort of vet how a project happens, you know, what logistics you use, what kind of equipment, et cetera. It's called the Wilderness Minimum Requirements Guide. That's something we are now in the process of sort of digging into, you know, proposing certain methods and showing, you know, if you're using a helicopter, how many helicopter flights? If you're using stock, how many stock? How many trips? What trails are they going to take? Where are people going to camp? Where are they going to go to the bathroom? You know, all this kind of stuff that you have to think through to really decide what your true benefit on the landscape is. The things you vet are effects to wilderness character, your impacts to natural resources. Things we will look at are obviously cost effectiveness, access to the site, safety considerations, and then timing and duration. You know, it's possible that in certain methods, you could do this project in a few weeks. If you did it with super traditional methods, it may take a few months to a couple of years, but that's something, you know, we sort of have to work through and figure out. I thought that was my ringtone. So moving on to sort of the flow side of the equation, the rehabilitation side of the potential projects. Like I said, all of the dams store about 2,500 acre feet, 22 CFS. If you release that all at one time, you would actually pulse about 43 CFS of water over the course of 1 month in the Rattlesnake Creek. I mean, that's literally if everything was at full pull and you had a way to like pull the boards on everything at one time and it went rushing down. That would really never happen because right now there's really only like 1 or 2 lakes that we can actually use and have effective outlet structures. Everything else is rusted shut, collapsed, you know, broken, whatever it is. Big Lake, which is fortunately one of the bigger lakes, is one of the only ones you can actually go up and turn a wheel and actually spill water into the creek. The other ones are, you know, either impossible or very difficult to actually use right now. So Sanders and Big Lake, because of their size, because of their water rights, are the two that are sort of being most heavily investigated for potential rehab opportunities in the future. They're not only the biggest, but like I said, they're the deepest, which means from a water temperature perspective, that's super critical. And they have like 60% of all the water rights combined. So like I said, we did a test release in 2019 and again in 2021 from Big Lake. We had a bunch of different measuring stations for flow and temperature all along the creek. We were also measuring flow at the lake itself when we turned the wheel and opened it up. Basically, what I think we found in August of 2019 is that we were able to raise the stream flow of Rattlesnake Creek by about 8 CFS. And it was running at about 20 to 30 at that time. So it was, you know, somewhere on the order of a 30 to 40% increase in stream flow in August. And that lasted for 3, maybe 4 weeks, which, you know, isn't bad. You can see the little graph down here at the bottom if you're really interested in. There was a couple rain events that showed up around that time. So it sort of, you know, confuse the information a little bit, but there's no doubt there was a signal from the pulse. You can see it right there. And then obviously a gradual decline until some rain came. From a temperature perspective, it was not as clear. Interestingly, when we opened the water at Big Lake, you know, the water in Big Lake was about 10 degrees Celsius when we started releasing water. And it climbed to 14 degrees Celsius pretty quickly. and then plateaued at about 16 degrees Celsius pretty quickly. So the water got warmer as we let it out. And there's no clear reason that we know of why that happened. You can see the lake temperatures for Big Lake at depth on the left-hand side of the chart. So, you know, the water at depth was 10 degrees Celsius, which is what we were reading coming out of the pipe, but it quickly basically jumped to the temperature at the surface of the lake. So even though the pipe is deep and below in the lake, something happened that basically started drawing water from the top of the lake, which I think we called a siphon, you know, or a whirlpool, which essentially meant for some reason water started whirling from the top down to the bottom rather than water from the bottom just sort of coming out the bottom of the pipe. That was just one of the weird things that happened. It's not a huge deal. It doesn't mean that we can't release cold water into Rattlesnake Creek in the future. It just means if you do it this way, you're going to somehow get surface water instead of deep water. And it's just something else to figure out, but certainly wasn't something we expected to happen. Even though the water was warmer, you know, we were releasing 8 CFS, we saw a slight increase in temperature in Rattlesnake Creek downstream, but it wasn't huge at the other monitoring stations. So right now, you know, basically, like I said, we're in 2022. We're looking at a pilot project on McKinley Lake, hopefully in the summer of 2023, which means figuring out how we effectively decommission one of these dams. How do we get there? How do we do it? What does it cost? What is the permitting like? What is the public's, you know, input in the whole process? How do they feel about it? How does that impact our future projects in the wilderness? Not, you know, both decommissioning and potential rebuild projects. At the same time, continuing to analyze data from the historical information we have for Big Lake and Sanders Lake, as well as the information from our test releases and other information, trying to figure out how feasible is it to actually rebuild one of these dams, effectively maintain it and operate it into the future. And if we're lucky, we'll figure out how to let water out of Sanders Lake either this year or next year. There's some issues with the outlet infrastructure, like I mentioned, some of it's collapsed. But we're trying to figure out how to overcome that and see what effect letting water out of Sanders would actually have on the rest of the creek. And, oh, I went too far. I'll go back to the last slide, but I think that's all we've got here. Slideshow. Okay, we'll start at the beginning again. That's it. Colin raised his hand, but I think you guys had some method for questions back there. Do you want to figure out how you do it?
We do have a number of people on Zoom. I don't have any questions yet, but you guys ask your questions. I'll repeat the question so everybody on Zoom can hear it. And then if I have some questions from the Zoom folks, then I'll raise my hand.
Joe.
The storage capacity, have you guys, did you take the differences in natural levels of the lake?
Yep.
Is that how that?
Yeah. So yeah, the claimed storage rate exactly would be, we assume what's on paper is the increase in storage from natural lake levels due to the building of the dam. So yeah, it's what you can actually release. So theoretically, if you release all the stored water down to the bottom of the pipe, then what you have from there below is the natural lake level from the pipe down on the rest of it.
Yeah, Rob, I'm Joe from WIC.
Hey, Joe.
Couple of questions. When you did the releases, obviously you looked at temperature. Did you notice anything in terms of changes in dissolved oxygen that might have been due to eutrophication or anything like that? Some of those more stagnant lakes?
It's a great question.
Or chemistry?
Yeah, to my knowledge, we did not monitor that, but right now, working with some of our consultants, we're building a monitoring plan for the next round of water releases, which I think will be a little more sophisticated. And I think that would be a great suggestion for what we're gonna do then. It was straight up volume and some temperature probes in the creek back then.
I'm just thinking if you got up to some of the warmer temperatures, you could have a slight change in dissolved oxygen.
Yeah.
What from the water chemistry that was stagnant.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thought process right now is if we can figure out an engineering fix so that we can, when we release water, or if we release water, we know we can pull colder water from the bottom of the lake, then that would be a worthwhile venture, which I sort of assume it's just a simple engineering fix, based upon where your outlet pipe is and what volume of water you're pulling in to basically control the temperature. I think that whirlpool effect was, probably just some artifact of a very simple outlet structure, being opened all the way, but I don't know.
On those releases, because I'm not familiar, where's Lawrence Bridge? Which bridge is that?
Oh,
We're measuring.
did I have that? Did I write that in the slide? I could go back to that. So, geez, what's the name of the bridge at the 8 mile mark? Franklin Bridge. Yeah. So Franklin Bridge is, if you went from the Rattlesnake Trailhead and walked, I think it's 7 or 8 miles. The road trail goes up and crosses. It's the only main bridge on the trail. That's Franklin Bridge. So do I have
Did you measure like the flow to see if it reached all the way down into town as well?
Yep. Yeah. So we have that DNRC stream gauge on Rattlesnake Creek, and that did show a signature of that release. I think it took 24 hours or something like that. I'd have to look back at it, but let me see. Sorry if you're watching this. Where's that thing right there? So yeah, that one was Franklin Bridge. That would have been from an actual in-stream probe that we had. I think that the same thing essentially happened at Greeno Park and Rattlesnake Creek, but I think the peak was, that kind of jump was a little bit more gradual because it was taking longer and attenuating downstream. But it definitely showed up. Both times we did it, we saw it, the signature at downtown, which is pretty cool to see that it went that far.
I've been kind of keeping an eye on those DNRC stream gauges. And last weekend I saw that the discharge rate just nearly doubled.
Yeah.
And I was curious this is kind of like a multifaceted question
Oh,
for
good.
you.
Yeah.
But like how you predict change in climate and discharge or release from the lakes will impact these gauges. I don't know how many gauges there are on the Rattlesnake in proximity to the lakes, but I'm just interested in like what kind of readings can we anticipate seeing as you move further with this project?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So, in terms of like official gauges, there's one right at the second upstream footbridge in Greeno Park that's managed by DNRC. It's on their website. That's a permanent station. Everything else we used to monitor flow releases was all just temporary, small in-stream probes that were put in there for the purpose of those test releases. So none of that's available online. None of it's even in the creek right now. So there's one gauge. In terms of what's happening on Rattlesnake Creek, just to give you some numbers. So right now, Rattlesnake Creek is like at 150 CFS. It's sort of average spring flow is around 500 CFS. So it's coming up. If it gets above 1,000 or so, that's pretty big. But it's going to hover like between 50 and 100 usually in this winter, spring, something like that. So the second sort of part of your question in relation to climate change, I think what we're seeing generally, and you guys probably see this watching rivers, is generally spring peaks are coming earlier, right? 3 to 4 weeks earlier than they usually did. They're starting to get less than they have been before. If you look at the Stewart Peak snow tell right now, there's like 72 inches of snow on Stewart Peak. For the last 20 years, that's like in the lowest of the 5 out of the last 20. So in other words, it's not terrible, but it's low. It's for March 28th. That's a fairly low number in terms of snowpack. And that's a great reading for the headwaters of Rattlesnake Creek. The other interesting thing that I see happening on Rattlesnake and other places is we're starting to get kind of like this camel hump spring peak, where in April we sort of get this flash. It gets unseasonably ungodly warm in March and April, like 80 degrees, and all the low elevation snow melts. Everything kind of picks up, then it gets a little cooler, comes back down, and then the real spring peak comes in, what should be mid-June now comes in like late May or something like that. So, I mean, I think that's pretty undeniable. I'm not telling anyone any new news that, rivers are coming up earlier and coming up lower than they have in the past. And we're therefore seeing summer flows that are a lot lower and warmer than they usually should be. So again, like I said, Rattlesnake Creek, I think last summer it hit 8 CFS or something like that. I mean, that's like that much, water across the creek by the time you get to that point. So that's, when you talk about water storage, we didn't go into this a ton, but since you asked, everyone's talking about how high mountain lake water storage, right? In the face of climate change and drought resiliency, or if they're not, they will be, this is a place where there's already lakes with dams on them. No one else would propose to go into the Rattlesnake Wilderness because of climate change and build dams to store water to release it. But there's already dams on the lakes there that are literally written into the Wilderness Act that have been maintained and operated for the last 100 years. That's the reason we're talking about it. And, like I said, I don't even know if it's still going to happen, but it's worth considering given what's going on, in the sort of the way things are moving in the world with the change in the climate. Do you have something you want to add? Or?
I was going to ask you about that.
Okay. Yeah.
We got one from Zoom here. How do you envision undertaking the public outreach in 2022 or 2023 regarding the potential pilot project on McKinley Lake? So in terms of methods, time frame, where, how.
Is that Morgan Valiant? Like,
No, it's not.
That's a great question. Morgan Valiant's with Parks and Rec, but we will be doing a, I guess I'll call it an official public outreach process. We've already done a couple online open houses presenting information about what's going on. But we're working through with the Forest Service right now what our process is, working with them through NEPA, through the other, permitting compliance provisions to get this project done. But I think to basically answer that question, that's going to start, I would say, relatively soon. I don't have any dates, but the next few months, something like that, certainly before the winter. Like I showed you, we have kind of a basic preliminary design. We have a little more work to do on that. We still have to refine the methods of how this could actually happen. So if we used equipment, what would it look like? If we use manpower and horses, what would it look like? What are the other options? How long does that take? Stuff like that before we can kind of present it. But I'm not trying to dodge the question. I just don't have, perfect answers, but it's coming down the pike fairly soon. Later this year. Question.
So could you elaborate more about, like, you said this is kind of a unique thing and sort of a new thing, and people are talking about it now with these high alpine lakes. So are they not too common around Montana? And are you guys operating kind of in a new field and figuring it out?
Yes, and I forgot to repeat the earlier question, so I'll do that now. You're typing them in? Okay. He basically said, what's unique about this project when it comes to working in the wilderness, working in high mountain lakes? So for me, in terms of uniqueness, like I said, I'm used to working on mine reclamation projects, irrigation ditches, keeping cattle out of creeks, all these other things. So the lower Rattlesnake Dam removal was an awesome project. It was high profile. It was a big project. It was super important to fisheries. When it comes to high mountain lakes, one of the reasons that's unique for us is because there's less of a direct fisheries connection, right? So there's no fish passage problem getting to McKinley Lake because it's like, 13 miles of cliffs to get there. So we're not talking about trying to get bull trout to swim up there. We're not even talking about fish, spawning and rearing there and coming back downstream. That doesn't happen either. So you sort of have to make a little bit bigger of a jump when you start looking at these lakes in terms of why does TU care about this? Why do other people care about this? It's because the way hydrology is changing in places like Rattlesnake Creek. Rattlesnake Creek is a south-facing drainage. It's not super high elevation. It's like 7,400 feet or something like that. So when you look at Montana statewide, where our native fisheries are sort of healthy and where they're still resilient, it's places that are really high and really cold, right? So rattlesnake is sort of like in that medium area right there. With climate change, like I said, generally around the United States, we're seeing water get warmer. We're seeing we're having less water. So here's an opportunity right here where we have lakes that have existing dams on them that are derelict, that haven't been used, but present opportunities to use water that's already being stored, and in some cases, water that's already cold and being stored. But you just have to figure out how to actually do that. So that's the challenge is, from a technical engineering perspective, figuring out how you do that effectively, and then sort of being able to portray what the actual benefit is, right? Because it's not as direct as if I restore this creek, fish are going to come and spawn here, and that's going to be good. We're going to have more fish. This is indirect. And Joe over here mentioned it when he talked about dissolved oxygen and warmer lakes and the effect that water chemistry might have on a water release. So there's all these different variables that are now, coming into play when you have to analyze this kind of project. So, and at the same time, what makes it unique and challenging and interesting is that this is now a public asset managed by a city way up in a wilderness area. I don't even, I'm not sure if, I think Bozeman has I think Highlight Lake maybe is managed by the city, of Bozeman. So I don't know if it's a wilderness area, but yeah. So, I mean, this is a pretty unique set of circumstances in the way this is set up from the natural resource side, from the management side, from so many things. So it's a super complicated project, an interesting project, has lots of opportunities. And I think that, going back to the pilot project idea, that's one reason working with the city's team that we developed that idea was like, hey, we got to figure out, we can't just figure out how we're going to tackle 10 dams all, in one fell swoop and just get this done. Like there's so much going on here and it's so complicated. Like we have to take little baby steps here and then, learn some lessons, hopefully not make too many mistakes and then carry that on, into how we evaluate future projects.
Can you expand on the problem of erosion with these dams? Specifically, I've heard that a couple of the spillways or outlets were constructed apart from the natural stream of where it used to go. And can you just expand on would removing these dams help that problem? How significant is that problem right now?
Yeah, so the question was basically how is erosion affecting these dams at the outlet and the spillway structures? So that's a great question. I didn't touch upon this a ton, but since you asked, that's a picture of McKinley Lake right there. And you see that scar on the lower left? That's the head cut below McKinley Lake. So essentially what's happening is you have a dam structure with an outlet, and then every lake has an emergency spillway. So basically that means if the dam or the outlet got blocked up with wood, when that water came up, the water needs somewhere to go, right? Rather than sort of pouring over the dam in a place they don't want it to, it pours over the emergency spillway, which is sort of a hardened structure. In this case, it's actually, they just basically corduroyed logs and made a ramp so they control the flow over it. That's on McKinley Lake, that's starting to erode, and you can see what happened right here. So a head cut means there's like erosion that's sort of progressing towards the dam upslope. And on McKinley, it's pretty significant. I don't know how that looks in the photo to you guys, but if you go there, it's it's pretty big. So there's a lot of material being washed out right there. That is not the case at most of the dams. There's little problems here and there, but that's one where there's some pretty significant effect. That's one of the reasons we chose this project first to decommission this lake. It was like, rather than figure out how to spend $100,000 to fix this head cut, why not spend 2 or 3 times as much and just be done with the whole lake, and the whole dam and walk away from it. Once you remove the dam, that problem will go away because the water won't be spilling over that side of the lake. It'll be spilling out of the natural drainage. So problem solved. But because all of these dams were built between 100, 110 years ago, they all have issues that they're facing with some part of the infrastructure. You asked about wood and logs, I think, as trees die, as wind blows them across, they blow across the lake and they get stuck on the dam. That's one of the maintenance issues the city has, is every year they have to go up there and they have to cut them out. They have to pull them out. They have to get them out of the way so that they don't block parts of the outlet and cause water to go haywire. There's seepage at different parts of the dam, which basically means water is kind of, going underneath the dam, piping out little areas. Not a huge deal unless it gets big enough to start washing out, parts of the actual structure.
Rob, I was gonna say, one of the faucets that gets into that is the parent material, whether it's, in this case, we're looking at a fairly high percentage of granite. And it's extremely porous, and the aquifer is really porous, so I could see how that head cut got to be as bad as it did. But hopefully, and that's gonna play into your sediment load downstream, of course, what the parent material fraction is. I don't know if they did any soil survey up there, but it probably wouldn't take much kicking over some stumps and logs to make an assessment of what the sediment load's gonna be like.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Anyone else? Good questions. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, thank you.
Everybody get a raffle ticket? Put their name in the jar. Last chance.
How many did we put?
Yeah, they're all a heck of a bet.